Next, I'm going to be reading from my novel, Problems of Translation. I'm interested in the process of translation, and so is my hero, but he's interested in it in a particular kind of way. Problems of Translation is a comic adventure full of twists and turns. Charles Abel Baker, as some of you know who have been here before, is a mostly unknown writer of advanced middle age who is seized by the desire to see one of his short stories translated successively into 10 different languages, then back into English, a sort of literary version of the old party game Telephone. Unsuccessful at getting a publisher to back his gambit, Charles decides to accomplish his goal himself and accompany his story around the world, getting it translated wherever he goes. He has many amusing and at times perilous escapades, but throughout his journey, unbeknownst to him, 3 retired CIA operatives have been tracking him, working at cross purposes, on the one hand to scuttle his project and on the other to keep tabs on him and somehow neutralize our naive hero's propensity for getting himself into trouble. And now, Charlie has been kidnapped by a vicious drug cartel in Mexico. So last December, I read a selection right here in this venue in which, with Charlie dangerously disappeared in Mexico, these 3 ex-spooks were summoned to a meeting to see what could be done to rescue him. And tonight, I'm going back to Mexico, where our hero now sits, terrified, in captivity. This is an abridged version of chapter, well, the number doesn't matter. The title is, If Only This Were Reality TV. Charles spent a restless night. The hard, narrow bunk bed, which he'd had no trouble adjusting to the previous night, was like a bed of brambles now. It pricked and pained him no matter which way he turned. Came a time when he was sure it was morning, when he could not wait to be lifted away from this cell and taken to another location. Yet he feared that destination equally, that interrogation room, that altogether different world where he had witnessed, like being thrust into the middle of a Hollywood slasher film, the cold-blooded murder of a young boy. Cartagena had placed the barrel right against that alabaster, wrinkle-free forehead and blown out the back of the boy's skull. Blood and brains splattering over the floor instantly. Dead instantly. 1 minute smiling openly, though not understanding why he'd been asked to kneel. The next moment, oblivion. Done for no other reason. Well, they said he was a spy, but weren't they saying the same thing about him? Then to convince Charles that the same fate awaited him if he didn't cooperate. But how could he cooperate? He was not a spy. A short while later, he was led back into the interrogation room. He struggled to keep from trembling. When they seated him across from the colonel, he glanced at his face, a sly smile. The guard stationed at the door was utterly impassive. Charles decided not to wait for questions. Senor Cartagena, Colonel, please, allow me to tell you something right off the bat, okay? I have been... Of course, talk to me. I love to hear you talk. I am not a hero. I am not courageous or brave or anything of the kind. But I have to tell you, because it is the truth, because there's nothing else I can tell you, I am not a spy. I am a writer. The story that seems so absurd to you, so suspicious, is absolutely true. I'm a writer who got the idea in his head, perhaps silly, perhaps profound, to see one of his own short stories translated into 10 different languages, then back into English. I simply wanted to see the end result. Charles could hear his words cascading out, but was that really his voice, so very high? Slow down, he told himself. Sir, as you yourself suggested yesterday, I would make a terrible spy. I don't know how to keep my information to myself. What I know, what I usually tell to whoever will listen as soon as I discover what it is. Someone laughed. Was that his own voice? The colonel sat across from Charles, unmoving, his smile etched in stone. His hair was redder today. The color lift? I know, said Charles. So silly, so irrelevant that it's boring, right? But that's my point. I'm just a writer, a former academic. Boring, right? Cartagena hadn't moved. Was he a hologram? The colonel turned his head away slightly and yawned, covering his mouth with a relaxed hand. Oh, forgive me, he said, shaking his head. Late night, too much tequila. After a further pause. Now, thank you for your lovely speech, Senor Baker. Your passion is admirable. A bit actorly in parts, I thought, though. The makings of a thespian, perhaps. And yet, yes, a bit boring. But boring is not the question, Dr. Baker. The question is, how much of it is true? At that point, a cell phone rang in the pocket of the guard at the door. The colonel stopped speaking immediately. The guard listened for a moment, then, without a word, crossed the room and handed over the phone. Cartagena listened alertly for perhaps a minute and a half. Then he grunted incomprehensibly, snapped the phone shut, and tossed it back to his guard. He looked down for a moment, his hands flattened against the table. Then he looked up again at Charles. Another smile on his face. A different smile. And I have my answer, he said. And I'm going to continue on with a further chapter. A couple of chapters later. This one is called The Present is Past, the Past Present. The location has not changed. Signor, usted tiene un visitante. Charles rose from his bunk bed, groggy. It was the middle of the afternoon, but he'd been taking a nap. Why not? Everybody else did. It had surprised him at first. He'd never have suspected that members of a vicious drug cartel who prided themselves on their modern methods still clung to the Mexican custom of the siesta. He struggled to comb traces of a vivid dream from his mind and concentrate on what the boy was telling him. The hard afternoon sunlight slanted through the one narrow window in his small room, making him squint and shield his eyes with a cupped hand. A visitor, he said. Para mí. Si? The young man, a bit disheveled himself, had he been napping too? Bore a look Charles found difficult to fathom. Respect, was it? El arzobispo de Mexico quiere hablar con usted. Charles' jaw dropped. Then he grinned and chuckled. Of course, he said. The Archbishop of Mexico. Why not the Pope? Porque no es la Papa. His rouser, whom he knew to be called Pepe, looked concerned. Es verdad, he said. The boy was trying to remain composed, but Charles thought he could discern an air of excitement. Seriously? thought Charles, as he tugged on his trousers and tucked in his shirt. Then his skin grew clammy. Were they going to shoot him after all? Was this to be last rites? Wouldn't a simple priest do? I'm not Catholic, he said. Yo no soy católico. Pepe shrugged. No es importa, he whispered. Come with me, please. Puzzled, apprehensive, Charles followed the boy out the door of his room. Their path led along a corridor, then left through another, then right along still another. Charles had been out of his room only a handful of times since his last interrogation, weeks and weeks ago, and was aware that the building had many dimensions to it. But now he was ushered into a large room he'd never seen, with a carpeted floor, a desk, and several upholstered chairs. A few mirrors hung round about as well, and several portraits. Even a couple of bookcases, heavy with leather-bound volumes. The room had warmth to it, and the fireplace along one wall added to its sense of comfort and coziness. He stood in the middle of the room and turned to face the door. I am ready to receive, he announced pompously. His posture would have fooled no one, of course. Whatever this was, he was hardly ready for it. Pepe departed. Was that a little bow he had executed as he left? Several moments later he returned, escorting what was surely an hallucination. Or the first to arrive guest at a costume party? Before Charles stood a man of modest stature, outfitted in a scarlet cassock, with a lace-trimmed, ankle-length white ruche over that, and finally a red cape, all of which Charles remembered from reading about the medieval church during his graduate school days, was the habit of a cardinal. The cape was called a mozetta, he believed, and sure enough, a red skull cap completed the outfit. Was that a zucchetto or a biretta? He could not remember. In any event, someone had certainly gone all out to give him a moment's amusement. But then he spied the bishop's ring, and something changed. A little thrill ran through him. This guy could be real. Senor Baker, said his hallucination, or possibly his actual visitor, because when he heard the voice, 3 cherries clicked into place on the face of some imaginary slot machine. He could never forget that voice. Holy Mother of God, exclaimed Charles. Nacho? Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Pepe was as puzzled by his outburst as Charles was confounded by what he saw. The man smiled ever so slightly, then lifted one of his beautifully costumed arms and gestured toward the door and its young guardian. In a gentle but authoritative voice, he said in Spanish, Leave us, please. The door closed and they were alone. Holy Mother of God, indeed, said Ignacio. Yes, Charlie, it is me. But Christ almighty! Excuse me, Nacho. No disrespect intended, but I mean, wow. Why are you dressed this way? I had a feeling when we were kids, you know, just before you moved away, that you were headed toward becoming a priest, but wow. Are these vestments for real? Are you really a bishop? And a Mexican bishop at that? I am for real, Charlie. Not just a bishop, thank you very much, but a cardinal. Goodness, are you colorblind, my old friend? My official title is Cardinal Titular de Santo Francesco d'Assisi Aripa Grande, though I'm referred to most often as Primate Arzobispo de Mexico. As he spoke, Ignacio had begun removing his various outer garments. When he had stripped down to the more familiar black garb and white collar, he looked at Charles once more and smiled. Despite the streaks of gray through his straight black hair, he had the same square face, the same mischievous eyes, the same broad dimples Charles had known when they were youngsters on the ranch. Deep lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, but they didn't make him look old, just like someone who smiled a lot. The Archbishop touched his chest. Now I am again a simple priest from the parish of Tepehuanes, where I was born. May I hug my good friend? They embraced in the middle of the room, not ceremonially, but with feeling. Their eyes were wet when they drew apart, then hugged again. I've missed you, Nacho, said Charles. Then his face grew puzzled again. Wait, he said, Nacho, why are you here? Visiting a man imprisoned by a drug cartel. They didn't tell you. Charlie, I am here as your rescuer. You're telling me I'm free? Please God, I should hope so. I just paid your jailers $1.25 million to ransom you. Thank you.